Hello to all our LinkedIn followers, and welcome to today's session on best practices to create a culture of performance. I'm David Wasserman from NICE's portfolio marketing team, and today I'll be talking with Dave Taliancich, one of our top performance culture experts. So welcome, Dave.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Thanks for joining us. Dave, as you know, the title of today's session is Best Practices Around Culture of Performance. And there's so many ways to think about this topic. Can you maybe take a few minutes at the start of our broadcast today and describe exactly how you describe this concept of culture performance and maybe how this could be different than what people have traditionally thought of in the past?
Yeah, great question. And I think it's a good way to start. Now, I always think about culture in terms of really what makes up a culture. And it comes down to the language organization uses, the customs and practices they put in place, and really a set of consistent decisions. And that's the framework of any culture. And when I think about it from a performance standpoint, it really comes down to five main things. The first is really having alignment up and down the entire organization in terms of what's the organization trying to achieve, what are the goals and the KPIs might be associated with that, and then funnel that down to each of the groups and the teams and down to an individual level. So there's clear alignment in terms of what needs to be done and what's the end goal we're trying to achieve. And then there's just visibility into that. There's awareness that everyone knows their part. Like any good team, you know your role and you know what's expected of you. And so there's alignment and visibility. But then really it adds into that with the sense of an awareness of your own personal performance. And that's the part that sometimes can get a little bit lost, is that, every day, every person on the team should understand exactly their role and how they're performing and how they're doing and where they might be able to improve. And then there's that improvement concept. And there's a concept that was developed a number of years ago by a professor named Reg Revens, and it's called action learning. But I think of coaching very much in this action learning concept where you focus on opportunities and issues you want to improve upon. You take some actions to modify those behaviors and then reflect upon, did that make a difference or not? And that's a very important process to really driving a performance culture. And we see that in terms of coaching sometimes, or training programs, or other developmental efforts. But that piece ultimately, if it aligns to every one of those objectives up in the organization, becomes very important. And then finally, I would say there's just an aspect of teamwork and recognition that ties it all together. A lot of times the idea of a performance culture is around focusing on trying to fix problems as opposed to recognizing great performance and contributions of individuals and teams. So tying all that together really is what I think is the change we're seeing in a lot of organizations around performance culture, is bringing all those elements together.
That was great. So, Dave, I'm quite sure that many of our LinkedIn followers, not unlike you and I, are really still trying to figure out and adjust to this, I'll call it new normal that we're in, and to try to understand what could lie ahead in the weeks and months ahead. This same confusion, I'm sure, holds true for contact center folks, despite really the amazing job that I know these organizations have delivered in the past few months. Can you maybe give us some insights from what you see on the challenges you're hearing about leading organizations and what they're facing in really maintaining the strong cultures that they may have had in place before the pandemic?
Yeah, no, and you're right. I think there's been a sea change that we've all experienced, both with NICE and with a lot of our customers. And it comes fundamentally down to, there was already work being done in the industry around having more employees work from home, really changing that dynamic of where employees maybe work from home but still can collaborate and partner internally. But it was being tested, and obviously with the current pandemic, all of that got accelerated to the point where everybody was in a reactive mode, and it was simply, let's try to shore up what we need to in order to still deliver to our customers the goods and services that we always have been. So it was about really staying in business, and it was reactive. And I think what we're seeing now is organizations are beginning to take that breath, step back a little bit, kind of observe the landscape and recognize that when you are changing culture and when the foundation of that culture fundamentally changes, it does create an opportunity to say, we need to do things differently. I'm gonna go back to those terms I used earlier around culture. The language that's being used, it's the customs and the practices and consistency of decisions. All those have to change now. Because if you've got, instead of having a few people working from home, everyone is, and I believe this will persist going forward in the future. Organizations will find that this mode of operating works for employees and works for them. And so even after the pandemic, backs away, the landscape has changed, and it's changed permanently. So I think the need ultimately becomes in driving those things, like making sure everyone has good visibility. There is good methods of collaboration. There's so much information now available to us through analytic engines and other data sources. It's how do you simplify all of that in a way where you can communicate effectively and partner effectively and drive change and improvement effectively when you're not sitting face to face, or you can walk the halls or huddle up internally. And that, I think, becomes the biggest challenge, is how do we get there? And so I think that's what organizations are really now stepping back and saying, let's see if we can fix this.
I see. I mentioned in the previous question about all these unknowns, but I think one thing that's at least perfectly clear to me is the economic environment is certainly changing. It's going to be difficult, and competition for customers will become more intense than ever.
Absolutely.
We always hear a lot about the possibilities that technology can bring and stimulating innovation within an organization, but sometimes it just doesn't gain traction due to traditional ways of thinking. As we think about creating this culture of performance that you're describing to us in a contact center, what technologies do you see that maybe in the past being 3 or 4 months ago, were bleeding edge up till now, but given the circumstances are now really a perfect fit and ready to be put in a production environment in a scalable way by contact centers of every type, to create this culture of performance that you're speaking to us about?
Yeah, and it's interesting that you bring this up, because the emerging technology, I think that's been in the marketplace in a lot of other areas, and is beginning to find its way into this space of contact centers, even back offices, operations, revolves around artificial intelligence and machine learning, and we've seen it in a lot of other places, but this is where I mentioned earlier, there's just so much information at our fingertips now that we didn't have before. The power of things like speech analytics to be able to, not just sort of understand words and phrases, but really begin to understand the sentiment of the customers that your employees are talking to be able to understand certain behaviors that they're exhibiting. There's so much information that can be harnessed through the analytics, or maybe it's desktop analytics and what the employees are doing. And you're able to combine now this understanding of what's being said and what's being done. And you mentioned something that's so important, how we deliver services to our customers, and the competition, the competitive landscape really is accelerated. So with all that data, it's impossible for the human to be able to access all of that and derive decisions. So we have to rely upon things like now artificial intelligence. And these machine learned models become so valuable because they can look for patterns in the data that we just can't identify as human beings. And so the technology change becomes, how do we infuse that inside of a performance culture? And it fundamentally comes down to being able to have that information and using these models to surface up what are maybe some of the patterns and opportunities to focus on, the behaviors to change. And we've always done that, but now it's with more information, and the accuracy is even better. The models themselves can also help to identify what are the tactics and the various improvement efforts that have worked in the past on employees that are really going to be effective here. So in other words, is it training? Is it mentorship? Is it just some clear direction? And back that action learning model, you really have the ability for the AI to help identify and pinpoint what are those kind of changes that would be best for a given employee. And the AI even goes one step further to be able to understand personalities. You may be someone who's highly analytical. I'm someone that's more emotive. And so I like stories and analogies, and that helps me to kind of change my behaviors. For you, it might be facts and figures. So even how we coach and talk to our employees is different, and we can identify that again through the artificial intelligence that is now out there. So I think as organizations start looking at that bleeding edge technology, which quite frankly isn't as bleeding edge any longer, it's really getting infused into a lot of capabilities in the contact center space. Artificial intelligence becomes, I think, the real difference maker as we move forward.
Wow, this stuff is like super cool and super interesting. You know, in these LinkedIn Live sessions that we do each week, we really try to put, I'll say, theory into practice. And one of the best ways we've found to do that is by maybe taking a real world example from some of our talent that comes on our show and talk about how the technology has an impact on the contact center in the organization. Maybe to close out our session today, Dave, can you give us an example of how technology around artificial intelligence has played a role in driving this culture of performance in an organization that you know of?
Yeah, you know what? Good question. We work with a lot of different customers in the industry, from Comcast to American Express, American Airlines, PayPal. We've got a number of our customers who are really, I think, leading in the space. And I'll give you a couple of examples that I think are really relevant. You know, in that idea of speech analytics I'd mentioned earlier, one of our customers is, you know, taking really all of their calls, 100% of the calls, and using that analytical capability and then those machine learned models behind the scenes to begin really assessing on every single call, you know, what was that customer's sentiment? Were they happy or not? And did that change throughout the call? And then even further than that, though, not just whether or not the customer had a positive sentiment in that interaction, but what were the levers that changed it? You know, were they empathetic? Did they ask follow-up questions? Did they, you know, were they, you know, looking for opportunities to really help solve problems? And the analytic engine and the artificial intelligence can power all that. And that feeds into then the ability to have that personalized story to the individual employee about where they can improve and certain behaviors that can change. And it's done in a much more thoughtful way that this one organization is really changing how they interact with their customers. Another one has, you know, developed an entire career pathing model that leverages a lot of the performance data along with the information that the employees are looking for to advance their careers, to build models that would help them to identify what are the trainings or improvements or experiences they would need to advance their career. And again, it all ties into these capabilities that, you know, that we can offer. And so it's really exciting right now to see some of the changes that are happening and what some of these organizations are doing.
Wow, amazing. Well, Dave, it's certainly clear that artificial intelligence is a great way to create a culture of performance, especially in the new world that we're all living in today. And for any of our LinkedIn followers, if you have interest in talking to someone here at NICE about the solutions that we spoke about today, click on the Contact Us button in the link above the post. Dave, thanks again for joining us today. We appreciate it a lot.
You bet. Thanks a lot, Dave. Take care.
And to all our LinkedIn followers, we want to thank you for joining us today on our latest in our series on Agile Customer Experience. We hope you found the sessions interesting and insightful so far, and they're helping you instill agility in your business and in your organization to succeed, as I say, in this new world that we're all living in. Look out for our next session, the week of August 23rd. We look forward to seeing you then. Have a great rest of the week. Bye-bye.